All right, seeing as it is 6:31 and we have a quorum here in person, I'm going to go ahead and call this deliberation session of the Bloomington Common Council to order here on July 23rd, 2025. If the clerk could please call the roll.
Yes, Councilmember Flaherty. Here. Ruff. Rollo.
Here.
I heard it here too.
Yeah, I think he's on Zoom. Can his camera get turned on, maybe? There we go.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Dave.
Strasburg.
Here.
Zulik.
My mic doesn't work.
No, it just takes a minute to.
Oh, here.
Rosenbarger.
Here.
And Asari.
Here.
It takes a minute for the microphones to get turned on as you're speaking in turn because of moving to a different location in the room, just so y'all know.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the alternative setup tonight. These are definitely different mics, and I'll try to adjust my volume appropriately. So tonight, in terms of agenda summation, basically we have two primary things on the agenda. That is the discussion about sidewalk committee and the role of that committee in our work, and then public comment related to that. But we are going to start with council member reports and wrap up as usual with any notes on council schedule before we adjourn. So if we want to start with council member reports, and I think I've been asked to do that randomly and not just start on ends. And so I'm actually, but then I do end up feeling like a school teacher, like, oh, who's on the hot seat tonight? Because nobody knows where they're starting. But if, you know, I should like bring something to like draw names out of. I'll do that next week. Anyway, let's go ahead and start online with Councilmember Rollo. Do you have a councilmember report tonight?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Rosenbarger.
No report, thanks.
Councilmember Zulik.
Hello. No report, thank you.
Councilmember Flaherty.
No report.
Councilmember Asari.
No report, thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm going to break the trend and have a little bit of a report. I guess I have two things that I want to mention to the public, one of which is probably, well, they're just different. The first of which is I heard the news this week that Camp Atterbury is, the feds are planning to use that as an immigrant detention facility, Camp Atterbury in Indiana, and that is just a moment of disappointment that that facility so close to home is going to be used in that way. So I would like to, at this moment, I guess, urge anybody out there, if they have an issue with that like I do, to go ahead and contact your federal representatives. That is a federal property, and the federal government can use it in the way that they choose to, even if that was not the original intention of that. And it is very important that we are that we're maintaining some sense of humanity and ensuring that if we are holding people in detention, that they are being provided with adequate food, shelter, water, sanitation, and contact with attorneys and their family as may be necessary. And communicating that to federal representatives, I think, is important at this point, so that we can be a society and a culture that there can be pride in, because I don't have much pride in some pieces of that right now. The second thing I wanted to say was a little bit more lighthearted, perhaps, is that you may have noticed that the old Napa building is no longer there, and instead there is a pile of rubble. And I know that we all have different maybe thoughts on the convention center, but it is pretty impressive to watch a building being torn apart by a very big truck. And not to sound too toddler, and I'm looking at Councilmember Asari because he has a couple of toddlers, but big machines are kind of cool. So I hope that some others of you got to enjoy the big machines today too, because I went with my son and his friend and sat and watched big machines tear things down for a few minutes today, and it was It was pretty exciting. So that's my report tonight. So I guess that means we'll launch into this council discussion on the sidewalk committee. And so we do have some staff members in the room, and we're at this small table. So if the related staff members in the room want to come join the table, and if council members want to not all sit on one side of the table and want to instead move around to other places, that would also be totally fine.
I think I'll cry if you don't sit next to me.
So we can be more circly. And then if our staff want to put that first slide up. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give a little bit of historical information, then Kate is going to give a little bit of historical information, then staff is going to have a chance to like weigh in from like their perspective in terms of how the sidewalk committee has gone and how maybe changes have happened over time. And then we're going to talk about it as council members. And so while we're kind of giving that like history, council members should be hopefully thinking about kind of these three key questions related to council sidewalk committee. Should it exist? What is its purpose? And what should it fund? Is kind of the overarching what we're doing here today. So I'm going to start with funding related stuff. So right now, the council sidewalk committee, the funding source is the alternative transportation fund. And I need to actually find where I'm supposed to be. Okay, sorry. Let me go back a little bit. Within the packet that got distributed, you'll see some of the per year funding, which has gone from $185,000 in 2007 to $500,000 this year. That's just kind of for background information. And then there's also all of those funding projects over time, going farther back actually, I think, than 2007. But the totals are since 2007. And so the sidewalk committee budget is funded using the alternative transportation fund, and revenue from the neighborhood parking permits is part of what feeds that fund, and then it gets rounded out as necessary in terms of transfers from general fund or other places. And then per the fund creation, so that alternative transportation fund can be used to, and this is like information actually that the controller provided the fiscal committee with today, so she's been working on trying to spell out our funds for us. So it can be used to pay the cost of operations and maintenance of the city's residential parking program, salaries and wages, employee benefits, supplies, other services, professional communications, transportation, insurance, utilities, debt service, and other capital outlays like vehicles, infrastructure, buildings, and reducing the city's dependence upon the automobile. And last year, from parking permits generated about $410,000 in terms of that budgeted amount, or in terms of revenue. And then in terms of budget, $269,000 went back to parking, so I'm assuming that's managing the parking programs, et cetera. $200,000 of it went to engineering, and then $500,000 of it went to the sidewalk committee. And so those three numbers combined obviously exceed $410,000. So there was a transfer from the general fund to bring it up, to make sure that there was enough money in there. And I think that is all that I was supposed to talk about. Councilmember Rosenberger, is that right?
I think so.
Okay, great. So now I'm turning it over to Councilmember Rosenberger, who's going to tell us more about the sidewalk committee and remind us all about the process involved with allocation decisions and how that has changed over time.
I'm basically just going through the 2025 report from the sidewalk committee because that's where the information is. So we already kind of heard all this, but we're gonna do it again. Are we using Councilmember Strasburg talked a little bit about where the funding comes from, and then I wanted to go over the history just a little bit for folks. So this committee was created in 1847. I don't know when it was. No, I don't know when it was, but it's it's funny because I could have said 1947. It would seem believable, I think. Okay. So in its creation, in those early years and most of the years, the way allocation happened was residents, constituents would call in, email, chat with the representative about a sidewalk that has a missing link or a block or anything like that, and it would get put on a really long list, what became a really long list of sidewalks that were needed or wanted in the city, and then the council members would look at that list and pick projects just from the list. And so some years ago, we changed that process with the bike ped coordinator, and a rubric was created that took into account like density, census blocks with income levels, and I think like walkability and safety. And so from there, we also had a more comprehensive list of where sidewalk connections were missing in the city. And so we could look in a more purposeful way to use the rubric and then prioritize our projects based on that rubric. Always a challenge is there's barely any money and the projects are usually quite expensive. So we do a lot of project design and then sometimes construction, and sometimes that money comes from other places. Recently this year then, we did another switcheroo with how the projects are picked, and we started using the transportation plan, a la the Safe Streets for All plan. So now we look at the priority network there and pick possible projects. And we also consider kind of like biggest bang for the buck, because creating sidewalks where there isn't one is very expensive, and the $500,000 is not necessarily like the best pot of money to use for that. So especially this year, we kind of focus a little more on coordinating projects with other departments where maybe a street was already getting torn up and we could add aspects of sidewalks. So I guess what I didn't mention too is this committee used to very much be focused on building missing links to sidewalks, and now it focuses a little more or a lot more on the pedestrian realm. So it can also include bump outs, crosswalks, some traffic calming. Maybe, I don't think we've paid for a hawk signal, but I think signals could be considered. So that is like a little bit of the history. Is that enough? What else am I covering? Seems pretty good.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's about right. So now I want to turn it over to staff, which may be or may not be a surprise to staff. You guys sitting here, introduce yourselves. If you want to give any context to, well, you should probably say what your role is, because not everybody might know that, and then any context that you could give in terms of historical precedents or pedestrian infrastructure or anything related to this concept. Who wants to go first? Go for it.
Do I just press this button here?
Actually, just start talking and eventually we'll pick up.
Hello? Perfect. Thank you. My name is Hank Duncan, Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator in Planning and Transportation Department. I am the staff liaison for the Council Sidewalk Committee. Council members Rosenberg and Strasburg described this committee and the history of it pretty well, so I'll keep my comments brief. Essentially, my job, not just within this committee, but with any project and any source of funds, is to most effectively allocate the funds to impact street safety in our community. With this committee specifically, it is centered around the pedestrian realm. How can we most effectively, most efficiently improve pedestrian safety, improve pedestrian accessibility, connectivity? And as Councilmember Rosenberger mentioned, we are working with a pot of money here that does not fit very well with large capital projects. We want to encourage efficiency, and that means economies of scale. Sidewalk projects are very expensive, and Mr. Copper can speak to that in a second, but sidewalk projects are expensive, and with the current level of funding, essentially we are not efficiently spending the money that is allocated towards the pedestrian realm. What we did in this past year is reallocate some of these funds towards small parts of bigger projects. For example, every year, Public Works repaves streets. So we can improve those projects by not just focusing on the auto-centric portions of it and relaying the asphalt, but adding in sidewalk connections there, or adding in bump outs, or other parts of the project that, because it's part of a bigger project, is more efficient and more cost-effective. I will pass it on over to Mr. Copper.
Neil Copper, I'm the senior project engineer in the engineering department. So my role mostly comes in once projects have been prioritized, and then we take it through design, right-of-way acquisition if necessary, and then construction. I guess just historically, a few notes on the council sidewalk process is every year it takes a different amount of time to actually get approval of the projects. So some years there's a single meeting to reach consensus. Some years there's 4 meetings before the projects are actually chosen and before it actually gets to council to allocate that funding, which means that we actually get access to that funding at different times every year. I think this year it might have been June, maybe May, that we actually got access to the funding to spend this year. So that can be a challenge. And then just to note that there's often surprises with any project. We went into it thinking it would be simple, and then it turns out we actually need right-of-way acquisition on this project, or it's going to be harder to do this. We need to relocate a utility, or something comes up and our original plan doesn't work. And so over the years, we've developed more flexibility with the council sidewalk committee. It used to be very rigid. You need to spend this amount on this project and this amount on this project. It started with kind of percentage changes that we were allowed to do, and then has evolved into the chair of the committee actually can just say, yes, any project that was in the overall list, you can shift funding in between those projects, and that helps, but it can still be a challenge if there's a big surprise on a project, and it can get tricky with timing of projects especially, and so one example that's occurring this year is we've allocated funding to construction of a sidewalk on Jefferson Street, and it's the lowest priority of the year, and the idea is bid it at the end of the year, encumber all of the remaining funds for the year. We know it won't be enough for the full project, with the idea that next year's council sidewalk committee will then immediately make up any remainder of funds, which I think in theory works well, but depends a lot on timeline. So if we don't find out until May again, if we don't get that approval, what we'll actually have to do is cancel the contract, and all the money that had gone into the contract initially will go back into the alt trans fund, and we won't have access to it within that year, and we'll have kind of lost that contractor and that contract. And so there's maybe lengthy ways to get it back, or we would of course try to look for creative solutions before we got to that point, but that's the kind of challenge that we can run into when we don't get access to that funds. And I will stop there because I didn't mean to talk that much, but thank you.
Thank you. I find that very interesting.
Ryan Roebling, Planning Services Manager from the Planning and Transportation Department. I don't know that I can expound on Hank and Neil's comments so far.
Thank you, guys. So I think then with that kind of intro, what we're back to is council now, and asking those questions of each other. Should council sidewalk committee exist? If it should, what should its purpose be? What should it fund? And Councilmember Rosenberg kind of hit on this. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss this was because of how this year's funding allocations really seemed to change pretty significantly. And we were given a pretty significant bump between last year, between 2024 and 2025. And then it kind of felt like, okay, then we turned around and gave a whole bunch of money kind of back to Public Works. And so kind of like, I don't necessarily have a problem with doing that, but if we're going to do that, like, is there a point in doing that? And maybe there is, or maybe we should think about defining it differently or processing it differently. And if we should think about that, then how should we think about it? And it may, I think staff might be doing this right now. Yeah, I was going to say it may help to bring back that so that then we can see Councilmember Rallo. So, council members, who wants to go first? Councilmember Rallo, you have your hand raised. Why don't you go ahead?
I do, thank you. I have a question. May I ask a question of staff?
Sure.
So one significant source of funding that could be utilized is MPO funding for pedestrian projects. How much MPO funding was utilized, say, the past fiscal year for pedestrian-oriented projects?
That's tricky to answer because the pedestrian funding within the MPO has been part of larger projects. There haven't been standalone, I can't think of a standalone strictly sidewalk project within the MPO. There have been a number of multi-use path projects, which of course are a type of sidewalk, and that's putting a lot of money into them. But even those typically are paired with other improvements on the corridor.
Yeah, so this was now in Courtney Daly's district, District 5, but the College Mall Road project was, I believe, about $2.8 million total, and we got significant matching funds to pay for that. Are we still pursuing that sort of leverage?
I think you're referencing the Sayre Road multi-use path, just that
Sayre
turns
Road,
into
that's what I meant.
College Mall.
South of Morse Pike. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't believe that council sidewalk funds have been used as the local match, but the city certainly is pursuing that type of project.
Okay, well, I think that that's excellent because I think that, it used to be oriented mostly for roads, but I think that, shifting a lot of the priorities to pedestrian or multi-use pathways is a good direction to go in and sort of helps the cost, because the cost is obviously increased significantly. So happy to hear that. Maybe we can talk some more about it. It's, some later date where we could get a report. I mean, we have a representative in the MPO, so we could have that council member give a report on that as well. But I think we should be advocating for that, for use of MPO funding for pedestrians.
Thank you.
Anyway, I have more comments, but I'll hold them for now because I don't want to take up, monopolize the time.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you for those comments about the MPO. I'm actually the MPO representative. Just for some clarity though, Councilmember Rallo, were you just thinking a report from like me about MPO stuff? We haven't actually met this summer. Or were you thinking that a report from MPO staff would be, is that like a request about getting a report from the MPO staff?
Yeah, well, staff is best placed to tally the sums. It could just be a spreadsheet about whether the funding went to specifically pedestrian infrastructure, whether it was coordinated and a shared infrastructure that included side paths or sidewalks and that sort of thing. But it gives us kind of a better idea. So I think the staff would be in a position to deliver that information. But I didn't want to circumvent you on the MPO if you wanted to give a report on that.
I agree that staff would probably be able to answer those questions better than I would. So, yeah, okay, I'm writing that down. Thank you. So Before we go on to answering kind of those three overarching questions, do any other council members have questions? Yes. Questions for staff? Council member, sorry.
Maybe just for, yeah, anybody who would know this answer, because, and it informs the, I guess, two of the questions, which is, what's the history of, and I'm sorry if I should know this, but what is the history of it being in council specifically? Why is that money that council controls, and why not in like public works budget or something like that?
Rollo, can you answer that? You were here for the creation. You were here for the creation. You were here for the creation, right?
He was here. He was here at creation.
I'm sorry, just my mic isn't on. Okay.
Councilmember Rollo, did you hear the question?
I did. I didn't hear that you invoked my name, but
Yeah, we
well,
just think that you, as the longest-serving council member up there, might be able to give us some input as to
yeah.
why.
And I was on sidewalk committee for a long time, and it was, I mean, first of all, it was there were a lot of requests from constituents for sidewalks, and there were missing sections. I mean, well, first of all, there are missing sections, and then there are neighborhoods with no sidewalks whatsoever, and that was a function of a time when sidewalks were not required of developers. Neither was adequate stormwater for that matter. And so we're talking about a period from the 1950s through the 1980s when significant build out happened. And so some of these neighborhoods, you know, people just walked in the street in order to get to, you know, where they were going. And the idea was to establish at least some kind of functional sidewalk within neighborhoods that could route people through, usually along a busy street. And we often partnered with utilities, probably we still do, to put in stormwater as well. So they would, we would leverage more money that way because utilities would have a stormwater project that they would partner with the sidewalk committee on. But I think it was that responsiveness that the mayor, you know, and the council decided at some point, I don't remember the year, but decided to set up the sidewalk committee for that purpose. And then as plans came, for instance, I think our first one was probably the alternative transportation and greenways plan back in the aughts, and that was focused on, you know, how we could get from here to there by pedestrian or for biking. And so that became sort of a guide as well as individual requests from constituents. And, you know, we would take views and see that there were missing gaps. Say, you know, when I joined the council, there was no contiguous sidewalk on Maxwell between Henderson and High Street. And so the sidewalk committee set about filling those gaps so you could walk, so children, for instance, could walk the contiguous route safely on Maxwell, which was a fairly busy street. So I think it came from that process, and I think that the council has guarded it in the past because, you know, of course, we have a strong mayor, and the mayor has extraordinary power relative to the council, and this is one thing that the council has at their discretion that, you know, can be decided based upon, obviously now it's based on metrics and various parameters of those metrics and so forth. But you know, this would be my argument for keeping it within the council because, you know, obviously the mayor has extraordinary power. The mayor comes to us for appropriations, the budget, you know, code revisions and things like that. But the council's budget is meager. Our staff is meager. We only have a few staff members. And so giving that money, putting it into, say, planning and transportation is essentially ceding more power to the mayor. So I would think that would be an error. That's my personal opinion. But anyway, so I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions before we move further into? Okay, so let's remind us of our primary question. Should it exist? What is the purpose? What should it fund? So I think Councilmember Rollo just had a vote for yes, it should exist. but that didn't necessarily approach the what should the purpose be and what should it fund. So, Councilmember Zuluk.
Thank you. Testing, testing. Okay. I'll start off by saying I think we should be thinking about this less of as sidewalk committee and more like what our goal is. And when we talk about budgeting for outcomes, like what are we putting our money towards? And when we talk about the sidewalk committee, the first two things that come to mind are accessibility and pedestrian safety. And so how do we as a council fund that priority? It seems to me that planning and transportation is, I think the sidewalk committee makes it a little bit more difficult for them just in terms of like bureaucracy and the amount of steps it takes to get access to that funding. So I'm not necessarily attached to the sidewalk committee, but I would like to continue to see council have an active role in deciding how we do go about pedestrian safety and accessibility.
Councilmember, sorry.
And again, excuse the maybe foundational question, but what is the alternative?
Should that be another, I mean.
I think Councilmember Flaherty had a thought.
I think my thoughts on those questions are responsive to Councilmember Sari's questions, so.
Yeah.
Unless you wanted to share more, Councilmember Sari.
Oh, no, that's exactly my question. That was my whole question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, briefly, I think we're kind of going about what we are trying to accomplish here with respect to pedestrian safety and accessibility in like an entirely backwards way. We're starting with a sort of negotiated arbitrary amount of money and then seeing what we can manage to squeeze out of it in a compressed timeline that runs into weird barriers around having to spend stuff by the end of the year, et cetera. Rather than planning would be an approach that we could take to holistically think about the problem, what type of time scale it is we're trying to, quote unquote, solve the problem and what solving it means. Does it mean adding 180 miles of missing sidewalks in our city by the year 2050 while replacing another 10 that are, in terrible shape? What does that look like by way of capital outlay? Can we do capital planning on 5 or 10 year time cycles? These questions did come up. In fact, we, the council, asked them last year in our budget priorities memo, asking for sidewalk infrastructure and capital planning in a comprehensive and holistic way. To me, that plan and adequate commitments around funding would obviate the need for a sidewalk committee. I was just reviewing the Q&A from last year's budget cycle because we had a little bit of a misalignment, I guess, in understanding about what we were asking, what the mayor was committing to. In some email or another, she mentioned that the sidewalk master plan will be implemented. Sidewalk master plan is the term we used, and what we were requesting as the council. But what I kept hearing from staff when they were presenting the budget hearing, during the budget hearing, was essentially what Director Wason presented last week, an operational and maintenance plan based on a better data assessment, which is also important, as I said last week. So I think we teased out that disconnect. And Director Hiddle, for instance, referenced that, yes, when the mayor said sidewalk master plan, she was referring to the Public Works Department project about operations and maintenance. But that a sidewalk team was assembled across multiple city departments. Again, I think Director Wason mentioned this. And they would be tasked with guiding development of a sidewalk master plan or its equivalent for infrastructure, trails, side paths, non-sidewalk pedestrian facilities, et cetera. How do we think holistically, again, about the problem? We're probably not going to add sidewalks to every single street. Multi-use paths are another type of pedestrian infrastructure. And then it said, Director Hiddle said, depending on the answers to these questions, the sidewalk plan may be created in-house or may be commissioned to an external firm. In the event of the latter, Public Works and PNT have consultancy funds available. So this is all in the context of the 2025 budget. I don't think this is being done in 2025. Again, I think there was a little ambiguity on where we landed on it ultimately with last year's budget. But I asked about it again last week, and I think with attention and priority from this council, I think we can get there. And I think that's how you approach the problem in a way that gets us out of the shortcomings and challenges that are inherent to, you know, a laudable effort from past councils to get some attention and focus and money going to this important issue when there wasn't a good other way to do it. So I think that's where I'd like to see us head. I think that eliminates the need for the sidewalk committee eventually, but until we have that in place, I'd be loath to eliminate the committee because I think it's been simply through inertia, you know, and a sort of useful mechanism to have some accountability around spending on pedestrian infrastructure.
Right.
That's it.
Great. Who else wants to contribute a comment?
And I'd just like to say that, I mean, I fundamentally agree with that statement, that if you know, that, you know, sort of gets at, if these are the three questions that are guiding our conversation, it's like if the way that we currently invest in sidewalk infrastructure is through this committee and there's no alternative that is viable at the moment, I think the rest of the conversation is sort of, there's not much more to discuss. I mean, it's like, you know, we should continue as such and increase the amount of money as possible.
Okay, can I rephrase to make sure that I understood that right? So you fundamentally agree with what Councilmember Flaherty just said, that it's still like a useful mechanism right now because there doesn't exist a better plan for pedestrian infrastructure? Okay.
Concur.
It's like partial. I know staff has, I think, mapped all the sidewalk gaps. Like generally speaking, we know this has been used by the sidewalk committee. The multimodal priority network in the transportation plan, of course, includes pedestrian infrastructure for some of those facility types. And I think Director Hiddle was getting to the point that this is bigger than sidewalks. We're really talking about pedestrian infrastructure and accessibility and safety. And I think the Safe Streets for All action plan also does a lot by way of tactics and how to prioritize action, so a lot by process, but I think we're still lacking some aspect of the whole picture view of the infrastructure that we think is reasonably attainable on, or even, you know, is ambitious on some time cycle, and what it would cost and how we're going to actually, you know, capital plan for that.
Councilmember Rosenberger, do you want to weigh in at all on the discussion so far?
Hi. I agree. Okay. I mean, I'm glad that Councilmember Flaherty just said that too, because I think that, you know, not to be like defensive of the sidewalk committee, but like where we have headed with it is trying to like eliminate bias and use our plans that are available to us. So, right, like changing over to the transportation plan and Safe Streets for All, I think is right now the best we can do at using a holistic approach and like a priority network to decide where this small amount of money goes.
So maybe a slightly different question is like, do we see any issues similar to what we see with like Jack Hopkins, where our limited capacity somewhat limits the effectiveness of the organ? So you know, not questioning whether it should exist, but should it be slightly redesigned, reconstituted, or something of that nature to make it more effective at the goal that's that it's tasked with?
Kind of goes into what I was going to say next. I mean, I think that I just heard this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 members who are here that are not myself saying, yes, it should exist. And the next two questions that we had for guiding questions is, what is the purpose and what should it fund? So I think, Councilmember, sorry, what you just said was, well, what is the purpose and should we reassess what the purpose should be? Right? Is that what you just asked?
Somewhat. Maybe a bit slightly different is that it's the question of, insofar as we have agency and control over it, like what adjustments need to be made in this coming year to make it more effective. And we know one of those answers. I mean, I think that one of the things that would be very useful is more funding to it. I mean, I think that, and that's something that there's a lot that we have consensus across council for. Whether or not the realities would allow for that in our current state is a different question. But I mean, I think that we all agree on that. But are there other things? How else can we help? How can we be useful in this conversation to move this forward in some meaningful way?
Councilmember Zuluk.
I think based off of what Mr. Copper said, it might be helpful for us to start meeting more in advance to make sure that those funds are available, or at least if they're not going to be, that the Planning and Transportation Department has that information sooner so that they can make different decisions on projects that are being funded. So like, for example, if Planning and Transportation knows in November that they have a project that they're going to need future sidewalk committee funds for, how can we expedite the process so that we're voting on it in January or February so that we can eliminate that pain point, at least while we're transitioning towards something else, if that's the route that we go. Is that feasible?
I do think that's feasible. I wanted to actually add a different point if I can. I don't mean to distract from that question, but I just wanted, you may know all this, but I wanted to be sure it's clear that the money allocated to the Council Sidewalk Committee is not all of the money that the city spends on pedestrian infrastructure. It's actually the minority of that money. Councilmember Rallo alluded to the MPO funds where we're spending millions of dollars, our own locally funded projects. The Council Sidewalk Committee does tend to, or has historically been the only sidewalk projects, like nothing else is involved, but we spend more than the Council Sidewalk Committee does just on pedestrian curb ramps alone, and that again on crosswalk improvements and multi-use paths and road reconstructions that include sidewalks. So in reference to the idea of a bigger planning effort, I just wanted to make sure that was clear that that planning shouldn't be just on your this pot of money that is again the minority. So I just wanted to make sure that was known.
Distract at all from the question. I think that's a key bit of information for the question. Like, how then? What recommendation would you make to in that context make the pot of money that is used here like more effective? Like, how do we supercharge what we're doing?
So it all comes back to flexibility. It's not just about when we meet, but it's about how we allocate the funding to what projects we allocate it to. One key example this year. This was the first year that we allocated a bucket of money to repaving projects, that being bump outs, crosswalk improvements, etc. But we didn't specify exactly which locations that money was going to, because we know throughout the repaving cycle, changes happen. This happens with any capital project. We, as Mr. Copper mentioned earlier, we may think we have the funds to do this, but we don't, so we change it to site B, etc. For example, we were thinking about 3 locations on East 2nd Street, 2nd and Lincoln, 2nd and Grant, 2nd and Dunn for bump outs for pedestrians. It turns out on another repaving project on East Rogers, we had the opportunity to put in a pedestrian refuge island. If we had been specific about exactly what sites we were using those funds for, we probably wouldn't have been able to construct that pedestrian refuge island. But because that allocation was broad in terms of where we can use it, we were able to do that.
I think too, in past years, we have met in December, I think, maybe November. It gets so hard with the holidays and recess that is why then in the last few years we've started in the new year, and this year was later, just because it doesn't matter. But so we could at least do that again, like once the 2026 budget is set, we can direct funds. And I think too, a big change over the few years is I think the meetings used to revolve around what projects council members wanted to see, and now planning staff brings project ideas to us, which I think is a good guide instead, that you all come with ideas and maybe like version A, version B to look at and talk about. So I think that is useful. I think I would like to say, this was at the beginning, but I don't consider that the money went back to Public Works. I consider the money is with planning and engineering, and they are using it in coordination with Public Works projects. Thank you.
That's a good clarification. Okay.
Oh, another thing that we were going to discuss just around these questions is that it is called the Sidewalk Committee. For a year, last term, it was called the Transportation Committee. And so our second slide just has some pictures of what do we want to use the money for? Is it like about, so this is about the purpose and funding, but like, is it just creating those sidewalk links, or is it the pedestrian realm and the Safe Streets for All plan and like islands and bump outs? So some council members, I think, are on the fence about that, and I think it is something we should talk about, even though some of them are not here. I think that would maybe weigh in.
I'm trying to like take notes on all this at the same time as I'm trying to lead a meeting, and it's kind of hard.
I guess maybe I would like to ask, like, what, if council members haven't weighed in on like the flexibility of the 2025 funds and how they see that, like, do you like it, do you not like it? Councilmember Rallo, would be good to hear from you, I think, on that aspect of like the changes over time toward more flexibility.
Could you restate that, the changes over time, flexibility of the spending for sidewalks?
Yes, like, so for example, how this, in 2025, we gave $300,000 to repaving project coordination for pedestrian improvements. And in previous years, we have said, right, we're going to construct this half a block between 13th and 14th on Woodburn or something like that.
Well, I think flexibility is part of the, it should be, I think, if you want to optimize pedestrian access and infrastructure, it seems to me that you need flexibility in order to consider projects that wouldn't be necessarily sidewalks. So for a long time, we were not looking at crosswalks as much, but then it was apparent that, crosswalks were necessary. So I think that the process has improved over time. I really appreciate staff's input. Obviously they do this for a living, and they've got, their eyes on it quite a lot. And they have means to measure and test and quantify things. And but there is something to say for constituent input and people coming and saying, hey, I've been living in this neighborhood for 20 years and traffic's gotten worse, and we're more or less neighborhood bound. We can't leave our neighborhood to walk to the nearest grocery store because it's too dangerous without some form of, sidewalk or infrastructure of some kind. So that's important too.
Okay.
I had a quick question. May I ask?
Well, should we see if anybody else has a question or has an answer to Kate's?
Yeah, sure.
Because, I've mentioned that a couple of times, so I guess, I want to answer that and be really clear that I don't necessarily object to that, and I think that the flexibility is also good, but I think my concern with it is the, bureaucracy, red tape, that it's I feel like we kind of passed it back to be used to supplement those projects 6 months later. And so if Public Works had known that, or engineering had known that in January or February, then it might have been able to just be easier. And so a solution to that is managing to shift our calendars to do those recommendations and allocations earlier in the year, especially knowing when these projects need to happen. It's weather dependent, right? So it's April probably starts really your prime kind of actual construction. So if you don't know until June that there's going to be money, for such and such a thing, then it really, I think it gets dicey. So if we can solve that by being really cognizant of calendars, then I think that that's great. I think as a council, then we all have to kind of have buy-in for that, both with whoever the chair is and communicating with the staff, and also whoever's on that committee and making sure that people respond to requests for scheduling and those sorts of things, so that we can actually get meetings scheduled and then attended in terms of committee meetings, because that is sometimes an obstacle. And that's up to us to, that is something that we can control, that we each need to have adult responsibility over checking our email and responding to requests like that. So Councilmember, sorry, do you have, let's go back to Kate's original question about the $300,000 before we detour to other things. Does anybody else have a response to that? Okay. Now, Councilmember, sorry, I hate to cut you off, but Councilmember Rollo also said that he had a question too.
You're not cutting me off, don't worry.
Okay. So Councilmember Rollo, what was your question that you wanted to ask before?
Yeah, so this is kind of a broader question about pedestrian accessibility. But since we go through a lot of trouble sometimes to make greenways, to put in sidewalks, and then they sort of end at a point where there's quite a bit of hazard involved in crossing a major roadway. So I'm thinking of places like, the Hawthorne Weatherstone Greenway, crossing from Weatherstone to Olive. There is a flasher with a speed counter there. There's one at Olcott and East Moores Pike. There's a raised crosswalk with I believe a speed counter there to alert people, at least eastbound, I think. At the Allen Street crossing on Walnut, for that greenway, there is a crosswalk, but there is no lighting of any kind. I wonder about, whether we should be thinking about whether the city is considering or staff is considering hawk signals. So when a pedestrian arrives, they can safely cross because they can trigger a light, and that would give people adequate time to get across the street, especially those who may not be as spry and able-bodied. So my question is about, should we be considering hawk signals at some key locations that would facilitate this kind of crossing, especially at major arterials, from designated pedestrian, infrastructure like greenways?
I think that that's a great question that speaks to some of the original question in terms of what should we fund, and I think that Mr. Duncan has a response to that. Go for it.
Sure. So I'm going to go back a couple of steps and then end up answering your question. We've been talking about the goal of this committee, the goal of what we're doing with pedestrian safety throughout tonight. The goal is Vision Zero. The goal is 0 fatalities or severe injuries on city roadways. This all goes back to the Safe Streets for All action plan that we as a city adopted last fall. That is the goal of all of our transportation projects, including those funded by this committee. As we move forward from this goal, that has shifted a lot of the city's priorities in what we are funding, how we are funding it, and what types of streets or corridors where we are prioritizing, which gets into what you're talking about, Councilmember Rollo, in terms of those more dangerous or high-risk profile nodes and intersections that, yes, maybe we have developed something low stress on a corridor, but as you get to an intersection, that prevents people from crossing it. We are very aware, and that is actually probably the biggest impact of this Safe Streets for All priority network, priority intersection network, where we are shifting our priorities around and focusing more on those specific locations. For example, we as staff are prioritizing a project on Indiana Avenue because it has a history of fatal and severe crashes, because it has a high risk profile, because there are a lot of people who cross it. We are prioritizing in different grant applications, different projects, funding sources, crosswalk projects on Atwater, on 3rd Street, on these more high-profile corridors that do stop people from walking, from biking, from traveling in the ways that we want to encourage them to travel in. Now, into your specific question about hawk signals, we are considering every type of intersection improvement, crosswalk improvement. It's all context dependent on where we put what. It could be a bump out, it could be a pedestrian refuge island, it could be a rapid flashing beacon. There are a lot of different types, there are a lot of different tools we have on our box to improve these more high-risk intersections and corridors, and a hawk signal is definitely one. In terms of where exactly we put it, that's when we go out and do our public outreach. That's when we have our pop-up tabling events, our public meetings, et cetera, because we want to hear from the residents about what's working and what's not, and it very much is context dependent.
How can...
Thanks for answering that. Could I just ask, I'm only aware of, I think, one hawk signal. Are there more than, by the stadium, there was one that was deployed there? If it still exists there, I can't remember. Are there more that I'm unaware of? Mr. Duncan, do you know?
There's one on South Walnut, there's one on Winslow, there's one on East 10th Street. That's actually on an NDOT facility.
So we can judge their effectiveness because you got ones that you can kind of, test.
Yeah, so I think the answer is that there are a bunch, and so my question was going to be like, how much do those cost?
Pedestrian hybrid beacon, sometimes called a hawk signal, is probably more expensive. The equipment itself is probably more expensive than other treatments. I'm just going to throw out $100,000.
Wait, hold on, I'm sorry. We just had a council member leave. Do we need to call a 5-minute recess? Because we don't have quorum without everybody at the table. Yeah, let's answer this question first, and then we'll take a brief recess. For public knowledge, we have 5 council members in person tonight, and we need to maintain 5 in person in order to have a meeting. So if you would like to continue, Mr. Copper, so you were saying they're more expensive than some other treatments.
They're more expensive. The equipment itself, a lot actually ends up coming down to what do you have to do in the concrete infrastructure around a project, regardless of what type of tool you're using. So it's really hard to actually give an answer, but for the equipment itself, I'm just going to throw out a $100,000 number and then say it could vary wildly depending on what else you need to do.
So it's like $100,000 just for the flashers and the posts and...
Yeah, and to be clear, pedestrian hybrid beacon is the one, you've got mast arms that extend out over the street that have the red lights that come on and flash, in addition to the flashing yellow, not just the ones that are on the side that flash yellow back and forth.
Do those have different names?
They do.
Okay, so what's the one called that has the arms over the street? Because that's like what's on South Walnut, right? Whereas the one on Pete Ellis is just like the posts on either side.
Yeah, so the South Walnut pedestrian hybrid beacon, sometimes called a hawk signal, which I think is what Councilmember Barallo was asking about primarily. And then on Pete Ellis, that's actually a rectangular rapid flashing beacon.
Okay, so that's called a rectangular rapid flashing beacon.
It's real fun talking about all these different names at a public meeting and expecting people to know what you mean. Yeah.
Well, that's why I'm repeating it and saying it's super slow. So,
is this super relevant to her?
Well, it is. Well, to me it is, because it's the kind of thing like, is this an affordable piece for sidewalk committee to fund? So how much roughly is the equipment for the rectangular rapid flashing beacon?
Maybe half that for the equipment itself.
Okay, great.
President Strasberg, could I just ask? Are there any that require people to come to a complete stop, or is it just a flashing beacon?
The pedestrian hybrid beacon
cars come to a complete stop?
The pedestrian hybrid beacon does require cars to come to a complete stop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead and recess until 7:36. So that's 5-minute recess until 7:36. Thank you. There he comes. Okay, so calling us back to order at 7:36. We were just talking about both the cost of the flashing beacon systems, and also that there are actually different ones, one being like the full, I'll say like the full shebang kind of thing, which is like what is on South Walnut, that goes over Walnut Street like into Switchyard Park. So I think all of us know what we're talking about, but I also sometimes want to say things for clarity to the public, including public who might watch this meeting tomorrow or the next day. And then, so differentiating that kind of signalized device from a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, which is just the flashers on either end, like is on Pete Ellis, like is the crossing of the B line on, I was going to remember the street because I was right there this morning. But on the south side of town, there's some of those across the B line too. What street am I thinking of? Country Club. So like there's one of those there too, and so those are significantly less than the hawk signal. And I think that I'm going through that again because my question for staff is, are those like indicated specifically for like different size roads?
Yeah, maybe to clarify first, the B-line crossing at Country Club is a pedestrian hybrid beacon. It is the full, it has red lights, stops traffic. It's not an RRFB for short.
But it's smaller than the one on Walnut, right?
It's probably smaller because it's crossing a 2-lane road instead of a 4-lane road.
Okay.
To your question, yes, there are different places where we would use the different tools. So typically on a busier, larger, higher speed street, you would look more towards the pedestrian hybrid beacon that actually requires traffic to stop. And on lower volume, lower speed streets, 2-lane roads, generally you would look more towards rectangular rapid flashing beacon. There's lots of different pros and cons for the tools.
Okay. Cool. All right. And that was, of course, all in kind of the context question of what should the sidewalk committee fund maybe in terms of looking at pedestrian infrastructure more holistically as opposed to just sidewalks because of expensive sidewalks. So in answering those questions, the what is the purpose and the what should it fund, what are other council member thoughts on this right now?
Does it have I have not served on the sidewalk committee. Does it have a purpose statement of any kind in its existing
Councilmember Rosenberger?
origin story
I don't think it does.
or ongoing management?
I kind of feel like I remembered seeing something in one of the resolutions that was included in the packet, so let me...
I mean, it just, the main paragraph on history is that the ATF was created to decrease the community's reliance on the automobile, and sort of from that came the sidewalk committee. And I guess when we changed it to the transportation committee, we used that a lot, that the fund itself is for decreasing reliance on the automobile.
Yeah, and so like what I read earlier in terms of like what the controller gave me in terms of the fund, I felt like there were like different categories of thing in terms of like that fund could be used to pay for operations and maintenance for the parking programs, can pay for related employee and professional services related to that, and then reducing the city's dependence upon the automobile. And so the way I kind of read that was, oh, okay, the sidewalk committee portion of the ATF focuses on reducing city dependence on automobile. And because that's, I mean, because there's different categories of money from that per the controller. And then the most original resolution we could find or staff could find was in 2013. It says the committee shall be shall make recommendations to the full council on the use of the ATF fund money specifically budgeted for council-recommended sidewalk and traffic calming projects.
Okay. I guess with respect to the 3 questions in our prompt today, I think we're generally in alignment that it can be more than just sidewalks in the interest of meeting pedestrian-related goals of the city, perhaps first and foremost, safety, also accessibility, sustainability, equity. And I guess if the answer to the first question is that we think we need a holistic plan in place, which is what we said last year, then I don't know if we need to go to lengths to answer the other 2 questions, that it's a bit of a holding pattern until we can get the thing in place. And yeah, I mean, it came up last week. I certainly intend to ask about status and plans during the budget cycle, because there was a commitment last year during the budget cycle to move forward with an infrastructure, like a holistic infrastructure plan. And I think the transportation, I mean, that's going to have to be either an internal or a consultant, advised, for capacity reasons and maybe expertise as well, involved with consultants, which is what Director Hiddle said in the budget questions from last year. I think the Transportation Committee that's now up and running is, name-checked as the standing committee to advise on projects like that. So that seems well-suited. I think, again, with priority, this can move forward probably within the next year, and maybe 1 year from now we'll be talking about funding mechanisms to implement this thing as opposed to the dollar amount for the Sidewalk Committee's annual appropriation. I guess I'm interested in questions like that more than how much is this piece of flashing beacon versus this flashing beacon, although I appreciate the interest in the detail too. I mean, it matters, it's relevant, but.
I think I'm going down the path of there's not that much more to discuss. I don't know when I hear what page others are on. What?
I think that I have one more thing that I want to kind of cycle back to, which is
Okay.
something that you said about the name of the committee, and that it was the Sidewalk Committee, and then it was the Transportation Committee, and then it was the Sidewalk Committee again. But I feel like it's kind of a misnomer if we're called the Sidewalk Committee, but we're mostly not funding sidewalks and funding other pedestrian infrastructure instead. And there are, I think, going to be a couple of resolutions coming through in the next few months about committees. One being there was the suggestion about interview committees changing to have the liaison thing, and so then there was going to be some flux and stuff shifting around, and so a renaming or a reestablishment of the Sidewalk Committee to slightly maybe update language based on what we've discussed tonight might be appropriate there. And then similarly, Councilmember Sari mentioned Jack Hopkins as also kind of being another thing to kind of assess to some degree. And one of the things that I noticed kind of at the end, in June, I can't remember if I said it out loud to all of council, is that the founding documentation around the Jack Hopkins committee structure itself is scattered throughout Jack Hopkins funding resolutions. So it'll say okay, we want to, allocate such and such a money to all of these things. Oh, and we also want to change the Jack Hopkins committee to from 5 council representatives to 4, or the resident appointments from 3 to 2, or whatever it is. And so those are all scattered in there. So that's kind of another committee resolution that I kind of have on my mind to figure out, so that then it's easier to find in one place what the Jack Hopkins committee purpose is supposed to be. So I think the short of what I'm asking is, should we potentially rename the Sidewalk Committee to accommodate this? Does anybody have objection to that? And does anybody have any ideas about what the name could or should be? Councilmember Zuluk.
I would suggest Pedestrian Safety Commission or Committee.
Infrastructure Committee.
I like that.
I don't care, though, to be clear.
I think infrastructure does make a lot of sense, though.
Any other idea? Like, this is an idea generating time. Like, y'all can generate lots of ideas. You can also go, Councilmember Rallo.
Yeah, I like the idea, and I've been kind of pondering this, thinking holistically, and I think that it has more to do than just infrastructure. So we all know that the degree of injury from a car collision to a pedestrian goes up exponentially on the basis of speed. And if we're really going to address decreasing fatalities and injury, we should think about, enforcement. We need to enforce the speed limit. And, I'm quite horrified that at that Weatherstone Hawthorne Greenway crossing at Olive, it doesn't seem to have made any impact. I mean, that's just my anecdotal opinion. I don't know if there's been speed counts there. Maybe I'm mistaken, but it seems that people are just sort of ignoring that. And so, and I think that my understanding is that sworn officers are the only people that can issue traffic tickets. And so I think that we need to think about staffing of BPD if we're going to address pedestrian safety. So my point is, I like the name because it should be about pedestrian safety, and it has to be holistic, and it's not just about infrastructure. And I know that we would be spending money not for police on the committee, but just sending a message that certain areas, just having behavioral change on the basis of speed enforcement would probably make a big difference and actually aid our infrastructure. So I like the name that Councilmember Zulik proposed.
All right, so I have proposals for a pedestrian infrastructure committee or a pedestrian safety committee. Are there other name suggestions or thoughts? Feel free to email them to me later too. If you suddenly wake up in the middle of the night tonight going, oh my gosh, I have the perfect name for that, go ahead and email me. That's fine. Anything in closing? Actually, I'm not going to go to closing yet. Y'all can think about closing for just a minute because I'm going to go to public comment right now because we can't end the meeting totally. We need to go to public comment. So at these meetings, we generally just allow public comment related to what we have talked about. So I don't see a whole lot of public in the room right now, but if you are online right now and would like to make a comment related to the sidewalk committee, related to sidewalk infrastructure, related to sidewalk safety or pedestrian safety, please go ahead and use the reactions tab to raise your hand, or you can send a chat message to the host, and I'll just wait here a second and see if anybody raises their hand. The clerk has their hand up. Would you like to come to the table and make a public comment? Okay, go for it. Well, wait, is the timer ready from staff? Yes. Okay, when you're ready.
So this evening, I heard a few questions asked about when the Sidewalk Committee was formed and the rationale behind it. And I wanted to add that the council has a lot of these records in their files and in their minutes and everything else. So they are accessible to you if you want to access them either through online or directly through the iDrive if you have them. It's unfortunate that Councilmember Ruff was not here this evening because he was on the committee when it was formed in 2002, to answer your earlier question. And even doing a very cursory look during this meeting tonight, I was able to see that you all have been having discussions, and you all meaning council members, not these direct council members, have been having these discussions for almost 30 years now about sidewalk funding and staff funding. And even back in 2000, staff noted that council had added an additional $120,000 in funding for sidewalks that had not been planned for. And I think that might have been part of the trigger. I don't know if it helps you in your discussion this evening, but we are always available to help you find that information if you need it. And if you give us a little lead time, we can get you more information.
Thank you. In that intervening time, have there been any members of the public raise their hand on Zoom? Yes, we do have one. Okay, great. When you're unmuted, please state your name for the record, and then you'll have up to 3 minutes.
Can you hear me? Hello? This is Paul Rousseau. I'm assuming you can hear me. Thank you. I appreciate very much the comments by Councilmember Rollo. I agree with almost everything he said tonight. I would like to add briefly, personal story. I usually get around by bicycle. You may remember, I think I told all of you about being hit by a car last summer. And so then for 4 months, I was getting around exclusively on sidewalks or by bus. Well, when I was on sidewalks, I was using a walker, and then I was using a cane. And so I was not very nimble. I was not very spry. And I was shocked by how difficult it was in a lot of places. The connectivity issues, snow issues. Of course, that was perhaps an unusual circumstance. I don't know if we're going to have that again. But all these things really made me understand what it's like for some people who always have to get around on foot and how much improvement there is to be made. So I strongly support the Hawk system that was presented or suggested by Councilmember Rollo, and I strongly support the idea of more enforcement for speed limits. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sorry, it was hard to respond when you were asking if anybody could hear. These microphones are a little different than the ones that we're used to. Are there other commenters online? No. Great, thank you so much. Not seeing any more in chambers. We'll go ahead and close the public comment time, and then I'll bring it back to the group at the table. Are there any last final closing comments or thoughts? And of course, by table, I include Councilmember Rollo in that, even though he's at a kind of extended virtual table tonight. Any closing thoughts to kind of leave us with from council members or staff? Great. I always put a little note on council schedule here just to have something. The only note that I have is that next week we have a regular session next Wednesday on July 30th. Are there any other council schedule notes, any committee meetings anybody wants to announce, anything like that? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.